Okay, you all, if you are ready, I'm going to go ahead and start us off. My name is Jeff Gedmin with American Purpose. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you today. The subject area has to do with, as you do know, publisher Norton, the cancellation of a biography of author Philip Roth by a biographer named Bailey, and lots of ink has been spilled. I've had an ongoing conversation first with Bob Asahina. I'll introduce him properly in a moment. And then second with Bob and Devorah Goldman about the controversy. The three of us agreed that there's lots to this, some things familiar and some things said over and over again in a tiresome fashion, and not necessarily bringing us forward in any way, or looking at these, I'll call them episodes in cancel culture, with any kind of freshness or imagination as to what's actually fully happening and what are the roots of the problem. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Bob has written for us about this, has a piece with us in the pipeline, and that will be out soon. But today is a moment or an hour to hear from him and Devorah, who will be in conversation with Bob, interview Bob about some of his ideas and arguments. Devorah is a Tikvah Visiting Fellow at the Ethics Public Policy Center. She's been an editor at National Affairs. She's worked on The Hill, and she's a contributing editor for American Purpose. Bob is a close friend and advisor to American Purpose by now in the 8 months that we've been in existence. He's a distinguished editor and writer and book author, and he's been in editorial roles in a senior level at the Public Interest, at New York Times, at Harper's, at Simon & Schuster, and I continue to learn from him and profit from his advice. Devorah agreed to moderate the first 30 minutes. She's going to quickly, succinctly summarize for us what in the heck happened in this instance with Norton and the Roth biography. Those two will go for about 25, 30 minutes. You see how it flows. And then we'll open it up the latter part to the gallery. Hard stop, 1 p.m. Eastern. Devorah, the floor is yours, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So I'm very excited about this conversation. I was very intrigued by Bob's perspective on this issue. And the issue, as I'm sure you're all familiar with, involves Blake Bailey, who is a famous biographer, Pulitzer Prize finalist, winner of many awards, and who was granted private specialized access to the papers and exclusive interviews with Philip Roth for many years. And he came out with this giant biography, which Norton pretty abruptly pulled after Bailey was alleged to have acted inappropriately with a number of his students. Later, the book was picked up by Skyhorse Publisher, a small independent publisher who has made the book available in paperback and online. So as Jeff said, this has been written about, talked about kind of ad nauseum, the role of the author in relation to his book, what responsibility publishers have in terms of vetting the character of their authors. But Bob really has a particular perspective on it that I'm eager to dive into. So Bob, to start us off, what is your general impression of this story? And particularly, what is your vision of the role that narrative plays in this whole drama?
Well, if I can step back just a minute, if we think about the way the media in particular have talked about controversies, cultural, political, et cetera, for the past 30 or 40 years, there are a lot of buzzwords that come up. When Clinton was president, everybody was talking about spin. And then when Obama was president, everybody was talking about optics. What struck me about those metaphors is that they were sort of physical. There was a ball spinning, like a pitcher throwing a ball. Or optics, you were looking at something from different angles. But the word narrative has sort of sprung to the fore in recent years. And The best way to begin is to talk how Cynthia Ozick reviewed this book in the New York Times, which was the review that launched the book to the bestseller list. And let me just begin with a short quote from her. This was the first paragraph of her review. The 19th century novel lives on. Its name today is Biography. Its nature is that of Dostoevskian magnitude. And Blake Bailey's comprehensive life of Philip Roth, to tell it outright, is a narrative masterwork, both of wholeness and particularity, of crises wedded to character, of character erupting into insight, insight into desire, and desire into destiny. Now, there are a lot of things you could say about that paragraph. One, least of all, that it's overwrought. But what's interesting is that she compares the book, which is a biography of a real person, to a Dostoevskian novel, to a narrative masterwork, as she calls it. Now, this is pretty peculiar because there are many things you can say about a life, but to say that it is a drama of crises wedded to character, of character erupting into insight, insight into desire, desire into identity, is not, to me, the way I would begin talking about a biography. The questions I would assume a biographer would address would be, is this, what happened in this life? How does the life relate to the work? Can we gain an understanding by looking at events in the life versus events in the works as a whole, and so on? That's not what's being praised here. What's being praised is the story as if it were a novel. And that sort of takes me back to this idea of narrative. It's as if truth has disappeared. It's as if accuracy has disappeared. It's as if everything is back in the hands of spinmeisters or optics, and what we're left with is narrative. And what has happened to narrative in this period I'm talking about is that narrative has become completely relativized and subjectivized. And when you see the way that narrative is used in political discussions, for example, you see phrases like competing narratives or advance the narrative. And it's as if this is all a species of public relations, not a quest for truth or is this policy good or bad or whatever. It's all about PR. And it's not a coincidence that this overwrought paragraph became quoted. It was in the lead of lots of articles about Philip Roth. And all of a sudden, we weren't talking about Roth. Well, we weren't talking about the book. Eventually, we wound up talking about Blake Bailey as if he were the subject of it. And all of this, to my mind, arises from this focus on narrative and not on what should have been a biography of Philip Roth, an actual person.
Thank you, Bob. So I have a lot of questions. That was a really rich introduction. But I guess my first one would be, then what is the role of a biographer who necessarily has to sift through many events in the life of the person that he's chronicling and choose from those events in order to craft a story of a person's life?
Well, I think, first of all, there is an obligation to tell the truth and to be accurate, and to not, in particularly this is relevant to Bailey's case, not to become a prisoner of the subject. And this is particularly relevant because, as you pointed out, Devorah, Roth has been extremely, even beyond the grave, manipulative about who has access to his papers. In one case, it's alleged that he authorized Bailey to burn his correspondence after Bailey was finished reading it. Princeton University, where his archives are, has cooperated in this. They had originally opened the archive and Bailey had access to it. And then they closed the archive after Bailey finished his work. So you see by Roth an attempt to, as they say, control the narrative. And the biggest irony of this whole affair to me is that it got out of control. He had very clearly said when he was still alive, he didn't want his biographer to write a biography of his penis, by which he meant he didn't want it to focus on his sex life. And yet, if you read, as I've been trying to, this nearly 900-page biography, you see that there's a lot of focus on his penis. It's mostly about his sex life. So one of the questions to ask about a biographer, you're absolutely correct. A biographer has to tell a story, but which story is he telling? And is that story accurate? Is it true? Has he become, as I think is very clearly the case with Bailey, a prisoner of his subject? When you read the journalistic accounts, you see that Bailey and Roth had an unusually close relationship, and that Roth had, in fact, rejected other biographers because he didn't think they were sympathetic enough. So this business of what the narrative is and who controls it and so on does wind up going back to what you're asking. What is the story? What is the obligation of a biographer? And in this case, I think Bailey has failed, and yet he's gotten praise for exactly what he has failed in, that is telling a story. And I don't think that's the foremost obligation of biographers, to tell a story. I think the foremost obligation, as I said, is to tell the truth, to be accurate, and to help illuminate our understanding of the life of the subject to his works.
Thank you. So on that note, a lot of what's been written has been focused on whether a work should be considered independently of the author. And I'm sure that that is what Jeff alluded to in terms of sort of people, beating a particular drum. But what do you think about that? How should we consider this book in relation to Bailey's, mishandling of his personal life and mishandling perhaps of his actual responsibility as a biographer? And in terms of perhaps Roth's character, how should we approach this work, since it's being debated beyond the merits of the actual work itself?
Well, again, if I can step back, in this case, a whole century, there's a famous quote from D.H. Lawrence in his Studies of Classic American Literature, where he says, "Never trust the artist, trust the tale. The proper function of a critic is to save the tale from the artist who created it." And then going forward, in the 40s, when the so-called New Criticism was born, a famous essay by William K. Wimsett and Monroe Beardsley said, "The design or intention of the author is neither available nor desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art." And then going forward another couple of decades, by this time, the New Criticism had become pretty much established in the American and Anglo-American Academy. The French jumped in, and Roland Barthes, in his Death of the Author, said, "We know that to restore to writing its future, we must reverse its myth. The birth of the reader must be ransomed by the death of the author." So for many decades, we've had a view of art and its relationship to its creators that said, to understand it, we need to distance ourselves from the work. We need to view it from a sort of 1,000-foot level. Now, there are many things you can say about that, but it did dominate for many decades. And then about 30 or 40 years ago, this notion of narrative was born, mostly in the academy, even though now it's permeated our entire culture. And there was a famous piece in the journal Critical Inquiry, which began with an introduction by its editor, which said that we should focus on, quote, "a mode of knowledge emerging from action, a knowledge which is embedded not just in the stories we tell our children or to while away our leisure, but in the orders by which we live our lives." Now that sort of intellectually established not just the notion of a narrative, but that the narrative itself was interesting because it told us something about the larger world. So the whole impetus of the past 40 or 50 years from D.H. Lawrence through the death of the author has been reversed. So now it's as if anything is fair game. And what's interesting to me about that is that that notion opens up everything. Once you can talk about the order of our lives, well, the order of whose life? The order of the author under inquiry, the order of the biographer, all of us. Then criticism ceases to be about art. It's become about life. Which is fair enough if you want that to be what you regard as the proper inquiry, but it takes us very far afield from a biography and all of a sudden becomes everything else, which is why we see a biography turning into a discussion of the proper or improper actions of the biographer and a reflection on pedophilia, which again, those are legitimate things to talk about, but it's a long way from the book itself or from the author who is supposed to be the subject of the biography. So narrative has all of a sudden opened us up to things that really have nothing to do with the book. And this is particularly ironic in Roth's case, because of all contemporary authors, he's the most sensitive to this relationship between an author and his work. There's a famous example from his own autobiography, which is not really an autobiography. It's a work of fiction, but it was called The Facts because he was trying to make an ironic point about his own life. And that irony is spelled out on the very first page of the book, where in the epigram, he quotes his own creation, Nathan Zuckerman, who is a fictional character. And Zuckerman says, "And as he spoke, I was thinking, the kinds of stories that people turn life into, the kinds of lives that people turn stories into." And that's a quote from Roth's own novel, The Counterlife, in which Zuckerman figures as a character. So Roth is particularly sensitive to this notion of the relationship between an author and his work. And he makes great ironic use of it, not just in The Counterlife and in The Facts, but in many of his novels. So it's no surprise to me that of all the authors, he was most concerned about his afterlife. And it's also no surprise to me that because of this focus on narrative, it got out of control.
I love that, the kinds of lives people turn stories into. So is Bailey now example of the kind of life that people want to turn into a story?
Absolutely. Much to the loss of our understanding of, number one, his book, and number two, the subject of his book, which is Roth. And so we have this double irony of narrative overwhelming everything, including the author.
And do you think that there, you did a, excellent, obviously, job of talking about how the idea of narrative has percolated in the academy, but do you think that there's something in our culture now that is sort of in search of heroes? Do you think that we need to believe in the people whose stories we're reading? Or do you think that this is all just sort of a dramatic, reality show for people?
Absolutely. I mean, and also the opposite, not just the heroes, but the villains. That is, it's as if everything is turned into an article, in People magazine or TMZ. So we turn our attention to the details of someone's lives before we talk about their work, or in this case, a work about someone else's work. So as I say, we've got this double remove from what we started talking about to begin with. And I think, this is set in motion in this case by Cynthia Ozick. I mean, there's a lot wrong with this biography, this gigantic, thing, which I've can't claim I've read a whole lot of. I don't find it a narrative masterwork at all. I find it tedious and overwhelming in detail. But to characterize it as if it were a novel to begin with really shapes in the wrong way our understanding of what this book should be.
What do you think about the relationship of this saga to the way we approach politics today, where we have people shouting about alternate facts? We have, whole websites devoted to fact checking. We're sort of fixated on facts, but we're also fixated on the idea that the other side is telling the wrong narrative. We have to kind of steal the narrative back.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the language that's being used. And I do think that for all the preoccupation with facts, as with this whole new genre of fact checking, which arose in the last decade or so, the point of finding out the facts is not to find out what actually happened or what is true, but to assemble a narrative that is persuasive. And if I can inject a little, classical philosophy in here, this is the difference that Plato and Aristotle made between rhetoric and philosophy. Rhetoric, the object of rhetoric is to persuade. The object of philosophy is to pursue the truth. And most of this alleged interest in facts is really just what fact will support my already preconceived notion of what's true. And to that extent, we're not interested in truth. We're interested in a kind of morality play. And I don't think there's any question. We're coming out of an era where where PR has ruled, whether it's a tweet coming from the White House from one of Trump's deranged morning sessions, or it's the response where news stories have become so thoroughly editorialized that they focus on the narrative that the editors want to push across more than what the facts actually are.
Thank you. Jeff, did you want to open it up to the group?
I defer, but Devorah, if you're ready, I think you have a gallery of distinguished conversation partners ready to go.
Wonderful. Okay, so I suppose people can use the raise hand function. That might be the easiest.
So I will start with the first question, if I may, Devorah, while we're waiting for people to collect their thoughts. So Bob, for these problems rooted in culture, which takes time to change, and boy, does it take time to amend or fix, how does one start managing and tackling some of these things? Because you have, as you suggested, there's a market for it. There's an appetite for it. There are journalists and funders of media groups that see profit in this. How does one begin to course correct?
Wow, I wish I had the power to change our whole culture, but I don't. I think one way we do it is by being attentive to the language that we use, and not use narrative when we mean story, and not use story when what we mean is a journalistic inquiry. And sometimes journalism, of which I'm including biography as a form of right now, just for argument purposes, sometimes journalism doesn't lend itself to nicely shaped stories with beginnings and middles and ends, and characters we sympathize with, or dramatic turns and conflicts and so on. If you look at what's happened to news writing over the past 40 years, I have a simple exercise for you. Pick up a New York Times story from, say, 1980 and look at it, a comparable story today. You'll find that what used to be confined to a column that they called, quote, news analysis, the Times actually called it that 40 years ago, has now become the standard for most stories. That is, the stories are written from an analytical point of view. And I wish I could honor them by actually calling them analytic, but they're really more what I'm calling narratives. That is, they're not in search of facts, they're in search of facts that support a storyline. And that's kind of surprising, but it's happened so gradually over the past 40 years that we've become we've become used to reading our news that way, as if it is just a story. And so I guess the first thing I would urge for culture as a whole is to be more critical readers and pay attention to what we're actually reading. You know, the temptation, particularly in these partisan times, is, well, you know, I agree with that, so why shouldn't I just get the facts presented to me as I already think they're going to be? And that's what happens.
So we have a question from Peter Doherty, and then we'll go to Mark Plattner. But Bob, I wish I'd asked this myself, but what do you think about Norton's decision to pull the biography?
You know, it's one of those decisions that takes us into a different realm of inquiry, which is, you know, the whole cancel culture phenomenon. I think my unmediated reaction is that it was just cowardly pandering to what they perceived as a cultural trend. You know, I worked in book publishing for many years and published many controversial books, and only once did this happen to me as a result of a series of unfortunate events. I was the original editor and acquired the book American Psycho, which by a young author at that time young author named Bret Easton Ellis, which got a lot of controversy. And the book was canceled by my publisher, Simon Schuster. It was picked up by Knopf. It became a bestseller, and also, incidentally, an uncontroversial bestseller. That is, once it was published, nobody really particularly cared about it anymore. And mostly I just sat there at a time gnashing my teeth because in simple commercial terms, all that money that could have been flowing into Simon & Schuster's coffers was now flowing into Knopf's. And, you know, it's very easy to be high-minded about this kind of thing and say, well, Simon & Schuster did the right thing, Norton did the right thing. The term cancel culture didn't exist back then in 1980, whatever it was, 1992. But you know, even at that time, I felt it was a betrayal of simple, naked commercial interest, which we were a business after all, but also out of a, you know, a fundamental commitment to publishing books, not out of some, you know, lofty First Amendment commitment, but just out of a view that one way to serve the market of ideas is to provide a variety of different kinds of voices and opinions and so on, which I happily did with other books on both the left and the right. I mean, you know, Alan Bloom's Closing the American Mind is another book I published. So, you know, as a book publisher, a former book publisher, this whole thing makes me extremely uneasy. And as I said, I was uneasy long before the term cancel culture came up.
Yeah, thank you. I was just talking to someone about how many terrible people are immortal writers also.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so let's go to Mark and then Martha.
Yes. First, hi, Bob.
Hey, Bob. Hey, Mark. How are you?
I thought that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And it prompted some random thoughts. Let me just quickly throw some of them out there. First, I think your focus on narrative and the way the term and the concept have pervaded our culture is really spot on. It's very much true of political discussion too. So now you get the struggle between the US and China referred to as, you know, centering around competing narratives.
Right.
And now it's not that there's nothing to that, because persuasion does matter in the kind of political conflict. People used to speak about the battle of ideas.
Right.
Whereas now it's battle of narratives. Battle of ideas implied that there was, you know, some truth
Exactly.
in the ideas, rather than just spinning things out as people sought to do. The other point I would make that struck me very much at the time, very long ago, was when the Nixon tapes came out connected with Watergate. And you'd have tapes of conversations of him with Haldeman and other members of his inner circle. And what struck me was they would be discussing not what they should do next, but how they would present what they might do next. I don't know whether that marks some kind of watershed or something, or that's something that had been going on for a long time, but it certainly is true that PR and PR ways of thinking have completely pervaded politics these days. And it's very strange, as you point out, that that goes together with this emphasis on fact and on truth. When in fact, I think the whole underlying philosophic basis of the stress on narrative is one that, you know, a kind of Nietzschean view that there is no truth, there's only interpretation, so we all have our narratives.
Absolutely.
Anyway, perhaps not really a question, but maybe it's something you'd want to comment on.
Yeah, I think, you know, with Nixon and Watergate, you know, this is sort of a Machiavellian instance where it's not so much that it was new, but that it was public and that we became aware of it. You know, to go back to something that Devorah raised, you know, it's not that that incomplete, you know, stories are by their nature incomplete and they're selective, but it's why we tell them and how we tell them that are the issue here. And if the intent is only to spin a good story, then the enterprise is flawed. You know, we can say that a given story or a given account or a given narrative fails because it isn't comprehensive, or because it misses this or misses that, or it gets this wrong, or its interpretation is wrong, and so on. But all that, you know, suggests that the effort was to try to do something that was true, that was accurate, that was comprehensive, that made sense. But just to say, well, it was a good story, misses the point. And that's where, you know, I began this by quoting Cynthia Ozick. I mean, I think that really misses the point in a gigantic way.
So I want to go to Martha in just a moment, but Bob, I have one question since we've been talking. J.K. Rowling, there's been some attempt to cancel her for what many people see as, you know, abhorrent or, you know, unjustified views about transgender issues. And she was not canceled, but that was because that was criticism of her for something she thought, as opposed to something she was accused of doing. Like in the case of Bailey. Do you think there's any real distinction between those two cases? Or do you think they basically fall under the same umbrella of attempted cancellations?
You know, from the standpoint of a new critic, or from the standpoint of D.H. Lawrence, you know, I think both attempts, and with Bailey pretty successful, are the same. You know, that is, we should be looking at the work and not at the artist. I don't think that kind of austere version of what art is can survive. I don't think it was possible even when it was first articulated. I don't think anybody really reads a book the way Lawrence was saying, or the way the new critics say. On the other hand, I think we've swung way to the opposite extreme, where it's as if any fact, no matter how small or no matter how distant, about an author's life can disqualify him or her instantly, thanks to the magic of social media. So yes, authors' lives are relevant. The question is how relevant. And I think, as I said, we've gone way to the other extreme, whereas anything becomes relevant. And that's why I singled out that quote from Critical Inquiry, because it suggests that the field is open. We can talk about anything when it comes to narrative.
Thank you. All right, Martha, thanks for your patience.
Okay. Oh, I'm nothing but patient when Bob Asahina is talking. Um, well, I guess I'm a little bit, I've had a sort of bumpy ride with this discussion so far. And this is really a comment, but it's a comment that invites other comments, I hope. In the sense that a lot of ideas about storytelling and narrative have been brought up and discussed by Bob and I guess by others, although mainly by you, Bob, that sort of make it seem like a suspect concept in general. And I really question that. For example, the idea that you can judge character only by action can be found in Aristotle's Poetics. The idea that there's a meta-narrative, another version of you out there, was not invented by Philip Roth. It was used by Cervantes and Don Quixote, among other works. So a lot of this stuff about storytelling and narrative, certainly in the realm of literature and fiction, have been around for eons. So they're not part of the problem.
If I can interrupt just for 1 second,
Yeah.
one of my problems is not about fiction. My problem is about biography and about public events, which are questions of fact. So I'm in complete agreement with you about narrative as storytelling when we're talking about stories.
Okay,
And
well,
that's why I brought up Roth, who really has a very shrewd and sophisticated understanding of that. And by planting his own fictional character, Zuckerman, at the beginning of what purports to be his, Philip Roth, autobiography, Roth is showing exactly what you're talking about when it comes to storytelling. But it's fiction, as that quote from Zuckerman makes very clear. This is a
Right.
story. It's not meant to be true.
Okay, just so we've together we've clarified that. That's good. So what is wrong with this word narrative? And I think you talked about that too. And also Mark just, I think, alluded to it. It's not so much what narrative accepts into its generous realm. It's what narrative rejects. And the current use of narrative, I think its most distinctive trait, which of course has been said, but I just want to articulate it for my own sake, is that it rejects reasoned analysis. It rejects, scientific truth. It rejects truth that is arrived at by various courses of reasoning. And the origin of that is very particular in the academy, which is the critical theory that says that reasoned analysis is a power narrative, no more, no less, and that all we can do is assert our own power narrative against it. That's a very particular point of origin in academic discourse. And I think if we're going to go after that thing, we have to really be very specific about what we're going after and not sort of fire our pellets in all directions against narrative in general. And I just feel that that's a slight danger, because it's the reduction of reasoned analysis and truth and fact, whatever you want to call it, to some sort of assertion of power, a story told by power. I mean, that goes back to Thrasymachus and Plato. But that's the dominant idea that is the real problem. So that's my 2 cents.
I could not agree with you more, Martha. And that's why, again, I hearken back to, the distinction between rhetoric and philosophy. I mean, that's why I talk about PR. This kind of focus on this kind of storytelling is about PR. I mean, what you're calling about power relationships, I'm calling PR. It's who's got the better narrative, who can put the best spin on things. So I'm in complete agreement with you. I think you've clarified it, and no argument on my part.
Right. Peter? Peter, you're on mute, it seems.
Yes, sorry. Thank you, Devorah. Hello, Bob.
Hey, Peter.
I wanted to come at this from a different angle, which whether I want to or not, I think I'm bound to. More from the perspective of social science, and certainly teaching. While I'm completely in agreement with your you know, the general orientation you articulate, Bob, to these phenomena that we're confronted with. I find myself thinking about what it's a reaction to, in part. And while it does seem like the whole world is moving in the direction that you're talking about, it's also true based on my teaching, on how other social scientists evaluate one another's work, that there is still very dominant, and certainly it was more dominant when several decades ago, within our lifetimes, of this bogus and flimsy notion of objectivity that is so current in many quarters. Now, we're not, you know, you guys are all talking up in the higher realms of literature and art. And I'm talking several layers down, I think. But in many parts of our society, you know, the ideal is objectivity. And what is objectivity? Objectivity is you don't take a stand, you don't take a position. It almost is enforced boredom. You will not vouchsafe your view. You're just going to tell the facts the way they are. Now, I realize that's going to ring false to many of my listeners, because that's not the realm of high culture or of elite discourse. But I would argue that that's still very much dominant among large sectors of the populace.
Can you give an example, Peter? Can you give an example?
Well, if you're ask students to write a paper about Muslims in the United States, they will avoid at great cost to themselves, in terms of what I've laid out as my criteria for evaluation, deciding whether Islam is a problem for contemporary United States, whether it's a challenge or not, or whether it's just, you know, another religion and everything's wonderful. I mean, there's that kind of refusal. Again, I'm not talking about elite discourse, but I am talking about a large sector of American society where making judgments is somehow seen as problematic. Now, I'm also, let me be clear here. I'm you know, bear with me. I'm sort of, you know, playing this out as we're talking. I think what you're talking about and what you're decrying is in many ways a reaction to what I'm trying to point to. That it's untenable. You can't try to educate people with some notion that, you know, you can't you can't take a position, and if you do, you violated some norms of objectivity. That is untenable, it seems to me. I have the feeling this is not getting any traction with you.
Well, I wonder if by what you call objectivity, what you're really referring to as a phenomenon is more like sort of mindless relativism. That is, everything's the same anyway, so why should I take a position, or how can I take a position? So, I mean, that may go by the name objectivity, but I don't think it's actually objectivity in any sense that.
I agree with you, obviously. I'm not sure it's mindless relativism. I think it's more like, in the realms I'm talking about, it's spineless relativism. And that is more current in our culture than I think you might be prepared to acknowledge. And that in some ways is sort of what feeds on what you're so rightly criticizing.
I think I'm not in position to talk about what's going on in the academy, but I think as you describe it, these are actually two sides of the same phenomenon. That is, you know, if we don't really have a principled reason to believe anything, Well, we can either spin it into a story and, as Martha points out, use power, or as I say, persuasion, to try to make the point. Or we can just throw up our hands and say, well, it's all the same. So I think what you're describing is really just the flip side of what I'm describing.
I think so.
Mm.
But I think it's worth pointing out that it's there and it hasn't disappeared.
You know, again, I edited and published The Closing of the American Mind, which pointed out this very phenomenon you're talking about 30 years ago, where Bloom criticizes students for really not, you know, having a firm belief in anything. And he called it, you know, easygoing nihilism. So if you tell me that still exists in the academy, I'm perfectly willing to believe it does. As I say, I think it's part of the same general cultural phenomenon where relativism and a failure to, you know, really try to pursue the truth have forced this narrative emphasis on us, where it's no longer a question of truth, but simply a question of power.
Yeah, if I could just add one more thought, I don't disagree with anything you just said, but I would also say that some of this isn't based on some sort of, you know, philosophical relativism or a lack of philosophical spirit. It's based on careerism or discretion or unwillingness to offend somebody. I mean, one doesn't mean that individuals who engage in what I'm talking about don't have opinions and don't find other ways and other outlets to express them, whether it's at the ballot box or somewhere else. But it is to say that there's a big stream in our discourse that I think plays this game, and it's not satisfying intellectually, and it's problematic, I think, it's a problematic undertaking. Obviously, I can't do better than that.
No argument. Look, I think people have lots of motives and reasons, probably more motives than they have reasons for doing things. And I think you've pointed to some of them. I would love to, you know, sit down with Cynthia Ozick and ask her what her motive and what her reasons were for writing that review, which are baffling to me.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I thought those were really great points. We have around 10 minutes left and 4 more questioners: Nicole, Andrew, Daniel Goodman, and Abiezer. So we can try to do a lightning round, or we can continue the conversation offline. But Nicole?
Hi, my name is Nicole Penn. I'm on the editorial board here at American Purpose, and I'm a program manager for social, cultural, and constitutional studies at AEI. So I just wanted to thank you so much for this brilliant conversation. I just wanted to maybe push back or present maybe a bit of the millennial viewpoint here. I think there is just a bit of a difference when, you know, separating the personal from the political, or separating the personal from work. Once we move from like the hard sciences where, you know, you could be a monster, but you stumbled on the cure for cancer. And then when you move to the humanities, where you are inviting, you are constructing, you know, if someone were to write a history of this discussion right now, you know, the facts can be a little bit more difficult to dig out from the past. So historians are really acting as this guide to the past, and there are things that they're going to emphasize or not emphasize that you know, are a little bit difficult to disentangle from their own personal proclivities. So when I hear about this biography and then I read that this guy had these horrific relations, abuse of power, it is hard for me not to imagine, you know, what, you know, I do ultimately believe in truth. So I have a little bit of cynicism that I will be guided towards truth by someone who can't even, you know, move towards truth in their personal life, just because of the nature of the field. And I guess my fundamental question, having said all this, is if you think monsters are capable of creating beautiful things, how is that possible? Why is that so? Or are we just giving them an unnecessary pass? I mean, I'll just end with it's a meme now that amongst millennial women that you shouldn't date anyone who talks about infinite jest. that kind of individual is is probably a jerk and probably full of themselves and probably overrates their own intelligence. So I just wanted to lay that out there. Thank you so much.
I should add that I wrote a book review for the Los Angeles Times of David Foster Wallace's first book, The Broom of the System, which I thought was terrible and had no compunction about saying that. So I guess I'm safe on those grounds. Look, first of all, I think what you're saying is precisely supports what I'm saying. That is, it's because we have this folk zone narrative that we are in fact turning our attention to the facts of Bailey's life over and against the facts of Roth, who is the ostensible subject of his biography. So I'm agreeing with the fact that we've now turned our attention, and maybe for a productive way, I don't know. Nobody is going to argue that he's a good man. I mean, you know, the facts will come out if there ever is a trial, and we'll know more, but it's hard to believe that the allegations aren't true. On the other hand, there is still this monster book here. And how do we deal with this? The only way we can deal with this as a book is to read it. And frankly, I'm having a lot of difficulty reading it because I don't think it's a good book. And at a certain point, I'm going to give up. But if I give up, it'll be because of the book itself, not because what I know or don't know about Blake Bailey. And I think the effort to pursue the truth obliges us to deal with the object itself. And the further we get from it, the less we're engaging in an actual intellectual enterprise. We're engaging in PR, we're engaging in gossip, we're engaging in prurient behavior on our own part. You know, the answer to Blake Bailey, to me, is to read his book. As an author, the answer to Blake Bailey as a human being is to put him on trial, which is fine with me.
Thank you. All right, Andrew.
There we go. I just had to find the unmute button. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon to everyone. I guess my question concerns another action by Norton. Not only did they take the Roth biography by Bailey out of print, they also went back into their mid-list catalog and took a very, very interesting memoir that Bailey had written called The Splendid Things We Planned out of print. And this was a memoir that focused on his family life and particularly his relationship with his older brother, who had a lot of mental health issues and very bad drug abuse issues. I guess my question is, I mean, are we entering an era when, just like in the old Soviet Union, persons who have fallen into disfavor are officially erased from history, that, you know, all traces of them in the public record get abolished? Because, I mean, that's what certainly the pulling of this memoir feels like to me, because actually, if you want clues to Bailey's character and what sort of formative influences may have, you know, played a big role, perhaps in some of these behaviors, it's all there in this memoir, and yet the memoir is being disappeared. I'll let you all respond.
Well, I would say I would be more worried if Skyhorse hadn't picked up the book, In other words, if the book had just disappeared forever, then I would say, yeah, this is something we should really be concerned about. But in this particular case, there is a market response. Somebody else, another publisher said, hey, this book, is making some money. I think it's a purely commercial motive, but so what? It keeps the book in print. As for a smaller book, will it disappear? I don't know. I mean, one of the good and bad things about the internet is that things never disappear. And it's harder and harder for the words out of print to have any real meaning. So I would be worried if the facts said, yes, this is actually happening, but at least in this case, it's not happening. Thanks to Skyhorse, thanks to naked commercial interest, there is an alternative. And the internet, with all its problems, is keeping alive lots of things that probably shouldn't be kept alive, but there they are. You can find them pretty easily.
Thanks, Bob. So we're just about at time. Jeff, I'll defer to you on whether we can get another question in.
Devorah, you can take a question if they can do it in 30 seconds, and Bob can respond in 60.
All right. So Daniel Goodman, who noted that PR also stands for Philip Roth, which is clever. Okay.
Yeah, and I'm so used to using those initials because in a lot of my correspondence with people on Philip Roth, and I've done a lot of writing for different outlets on Roth. We always
Daniel, you're using your 30 seconds. Now you're down to 17 seconds.
Okay, so I think it will be best to have the conversation offline if I can somehow. But thank you very much, because I know we have to go.
So I'm sorry to be rude, and Bob, forgive me. I did plug Daniel's piece at the top of the program. Please read it. I won't repeat the details, May 19th, with the Sloan Institute's publication. But I want to say the following. We do keep on a tight ship to be mindful of your time, because you have lots of things, probably other Zoom conversations today. I just want to say from my point of view, and warmest thanks to all of you, and to Devorah for managing this conversation beautifully, and for Bob giving us so much food for thought. You please do look forward to reading his piece with us soon on this subject. From my point of view, what we're going for in these 1 hour American Purpose Zoom conversations is conversations where we can actually listen, hear one another, learn things, and see a little conversation stimulated without posturing. I think that's been accomplished today. I add parenthetically, Bob and Devorah had a would-be funder the other day ask me, but do you drive to outcomes? I said, well, yes. And he asked me what a list of deliverables would be from today's conversation. I said, well, we'll circle back to you. Anyway, from my purposes, what a great, stimulating, enriching conversation. So to Mark and Peter and Andrew and everybody else who participated, big thanks. We'll see you again soon. Bob, really well done. And Devorah, thank you. Nicely done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Bye.